I hope deformed people are okay. I hope someone's taking care of them. Get this fucking thing out of my face.
Andrew Old Hickory Jackson, or Sharp Knife, as the Cherokee people affectionately called him, was many things. A distinguished military strategist, populist icon, cunning legal mind, radical economist, 7th United States President, walking manifestation of death, and generally the main character of the world from 1767 to 1845. Even as much of the more contemporary works on Jackson's life tend to take a highly critical approach and sort of try to dispel positive notions about the man, there's no denying that he lived an incredibly fascinating and productive life, charged by a furious hatred for most things, but a zealous love for his young country. Andrew Jackson was born in the Continental Carolinas at a time when tensions with the British were really coming to a fucking boil over all this taxation business. His father would pass away just weeks before Jackson's birth in a freak logging accident, and so his mother would take Jackson and his 2 older brothers to live with extended family on the Crawford plantation. His family initially hoped Andrew would become a member of the clergy, and so he spent years learning from the local ministers, but he was, quote, too angry for that line of work, and so at the age of 13, when he was given the opportunity to bring people to God in a more direct way in the Revolutionary War, Andrew was all smiles. The war would first take his oldest brother Hugh during the Battle of Stono Ferry in 1779, while Andrew and his brother Robert served as couriers and scouts. In 1781, Andrew and Robert would be taken as prisoners of war and, as the famous story goes, would be ordered to shine the boots of the officer leading their capture. Andrew told his captor the 1780s version of "suck my fucking dick." In exchange, he was struck in his face, but with a sword instead of a hand, which would give him the cool facial scar he would bear for the rest of his life. Robert also refused, like a young mass of pure hatred, and was pummeled on the head, almost certainly hard enough to badly concuss him. The boys were then marched over 40 miles without boots and without receiving medical attention to a prison camp in Camden, where they would contract smallpox and their health would badly deteriorate. Just a couple months later, the boys would be released and brought home as a part of a prisoner exchange, but it was too late for Robert, and he would pass away just 1 day after being reunited with his family. Andrew would be nursed back to full health, his anger now stronger than ever, and his mother, wanting to do her part, made a deal with the British to work as a nurse caring for American prisoners of war housed on their prisoner ships, but she would contract cholera shortly after beginning and pass away. And with that, at just 14 years old, the newly orphaned Jackson, having been deprived of everything he felt any love towards, divined his purpose in the world. Be successful enough that it's easy to kill your enemies. And the enemy was anything even vaguely associated with the British. Being a very bright child, Jackson took what he'd learned from studying under the clergy and used it to advance his schooling while working as a saddler and briefly as an elementary teacher, which is fucking hilarious to even think about, but is the first example of a long-standing trend of Jackson having this major soft spot for children. He would go on to study law under multiple big names of the time and was incredibly successful at it, being admitted to the North Carolina bar at just 20 years old, and after moving to Nashville, he was appointed Attorney fucking General just 4 years later. And all this is fine and dandy, very impressive, but how is Jackson feeding his insatiable bloodlust during these years deprived of the joys of war? Jackson dueled. He picked up the habit young, with most scholars estimating that he partook in over 100 in his lifetime. That number probably sounds ridiculously over the top if you're thinking about duels in the Wild West sense, but they tended to play out differently in Jackson's heyday. When duels were fought with swords, they usually ended at the first jab, and when it came to pistols, duels were usually just the 2 men weighing each other's balls, and they would intentionally miss their shots or fire in the air, then shake hands and walk away with a strange, newfound respect for each other. It was a very weird custom. That's not to say that none of Jackson's duels were truly violent. He both gave and received many scars while defending his honor or whatever, but they were almost always non-fatal. The only exception to this that we can 100% verify was his infamous duel with Charles Dickinson in 1806. Dickinson was widely reputed as one of the best and quickest marksmen in the country. When he wasn't betting on horses or writing libel about US senators, he was out shooting shit. A fascinating character in his own right, but he failed to understand that Jackson is the fucking protagonist here, not him. When he personally insulted Jackson and his wife over a horse racing dispute, Jackson let it go. Possibly because this was one of the few men that he feared could actually best him in the only method of conflict resolution that he understood, and to be bested would be to die. But when Dickinson took his slanderous claims and insults to the local paper in an attempt to tarnish Jackson's reputation, Andrew knew there was only one way to salvage the situation. He angrily demanded satisfaction from Dickinson in the form of a pistol duel to the death, then went to see his fat friend John. The plan was simple. Jackson needed to not only survive while killing Dickinson, who, again, was in all likelihood a much better shot than him, he also needed to look ridiculously badass while doing it in order to wipe away the smear that Dickinson had placed on his name. To this end, he borrowed John's very large and broad-shouldered coat because he knew wearing it would make it harder for Dickinson to find his heart. Draped in this ridiculously large coat, Jackson arrived at the dueling site and proclaimed that he would take pity on Dickinson and allow him to fire the first shot. I need to reiterate that I'm not fucking with you here. In a pistol duel to the death against a much better marksman, Jackson loudly swore to purposely be shot first. His logic being that Dickinson would hopefully hit something non-vital and then have to stand there for 2 minutes reloading so Jackson could take time to line up the perfect kill shot. By nearly every metric, this was a ridiculous plan that should have resulted in Jackson's death, but he was simply too angry to care about odds or major blood loss. Dickinson hit Jackson directly in the sternum, breaking it and injuring several ribs. With blood pouring from his chest and pooling at his feet, Jackson took aim while Dickinson frantically reloaded. His pistol briefly malfunctioned, but he corrected it before Dickinson could reload and shot him through the liver, a wound which would kill him by sundown. Political allies were initially concerned about the damage that this competitive ritual murder of a popular social figure might do to Jackson's public perception, but it ended up laying the foundation for his populist, man-of-the-people image that would be incredibly successful years later. Perhaps as a result of spending the following weeks in agony, being poked and prodded by early 19th century doctors who were, at the time, pretty much just making shit up and trying out random herbs on their patients to see what happens, Jackson went on a decent hiatus from violence. He wouldn't kill another man for several years, but he did finally dip his toes into the planning military conquest waters just months after his famous duel, after meeting with another famous duelist and friend, Aaron Burr. Burr, for those of you who don't watch musicals, is the man who fatally shot Alexander Hamilton in 1804. Burr was forming a plan to conquer Spanish Florida and drive the Spanish out of Texas, and he decided his plan needed the insane, violent insight of Jackson. Despite having very little formal education in the ways of war and having been in non-combative roles during the Revolutionary War, Jackson's early draft tactics were regarded as impressively measured and competent. They would never be put into action, however, as waging war on the Floridas and Texas was a batshit insane idea that no one else was really on board for at this point, and Thomas Jefferson was about to have Burr arrested on suspicion of treason. After all that died down in 1807, Jackson settled back into one of his many governmental official positions and the running of his small plantation. It almost seemed like he might have been ready to live the normal, comfortable life which befitted a man of his intelligence and accomplishments. Then the British came back into play in the War of 1812, and every ounce of that shiny, beautiful hatred lit up in Jackson once again. There were more moving parts to this war than the more simple fight for independence of Jackson's youth, but that just meant more enemies to kill. The British were supporting Native American resistance to settlers, which made them formal combatants, and the Spanish were still there in Florida, not helping Americans, which made them a real fucking problem in Jackson's eyes. But the Hydra has to go down one head at a time. So after a string of American losses in the Northwest, Jackson was granted military authority and immediately built a militia of 2,000 to march on New Orleans. But the commander leading American forces in the city, General Wilkinson, was someone that Jackson had openly threatened and accused of treason in the past. So it was not a happy reunion. Jackson was ordered to disband his militia and turn over his resources to the general, at which point he told him the 1813 version of "suck my fucking dick" and marched his men the difficult path to Nashville instead. While stewing in Nashville over how his government seemed intent on depriving him of the violence he so sought, Jackson and one of his colonels got into a very public drunken street brawl with a Missouri senator and his brother. It is generally agreed upon that Jackson and the colonel were in fact winning by a country mile when one of the other men pulled their pistol in an act of desperation and shot Jackson through the shoulder. He was still nursing this rather serious wound just a couple months later when the Red Stick American Indians, emboldened partly by the aid of the British, massacred a militia garrison at Fort Mims. Following this, Jackson was totally, for real this time, given full military authority to deal with the growing Indian threat, and he immediately went scorched earth without a second thought. Jackson razed villages, looted, destroyed supplies, laid traps, and generally took a very savage approach to dealing with any Red Stick population he encountered. Recruiting men along the way, and with a force of about 2,500, Jackson won two crucial victories in a single month at Tallushatchee and then Talladega. These major shows of force from the aggressive Jackson would really get the ball rolling on what would become a lucrative partnership between Jackson's militia and American Indian allies of the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek tribes, who were also warring with the Red Sticks. By recruiting amongst new native allies, Jackson grew his force to over 3,000, and at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, he shattered the Red Stick offensive, killing over 80% of their forces in the region, and just kind of giving all their women and children to the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek tribes as a thank you for their help, because holy shit, we used to do things differently. Jackson carried on with some minor razing and slaughtering from there, but it was generally known that the Red Sticks could not come back. For his great successes, Jackson was made a brigadier general in the U.S. Army, which is a 1-star, and then a major general just 10 days later, which is a 2-star. Once there was no living, tangible native threat in sight, Jackson would draft the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which would require the Creek people, including some of those he had served alongside just a couple months earlier, to forfeit over 23 million acres of land to the U.S. government. They had all seen how Jackson dealt with people that refused him, and promptly decided a few million acres was really no big deal. And all of that was technically a part of the Creek War, which was a conflict that coincided with the War of 1812 and shared many of the same combatants, but is its own thing because of its emphasis on native land disputes. Having gotten the best bang for his Indian-killing buck, Jackson decided it was finally time to get his revenge on the British directly. He marched back to New Orleans in late 1814, his authority now overshadowing that of General Wilkinson, and he immediately emplaced martial law and made this a total war city in preparation for the major British assault he knew was coming. Jackson then made two decisions which were highly controversial in his time. He made a deal with local smugglers and pirates to protect the city in exchange for amnesty, and he began recruiting freed African Americans and Creek Indians, paying them the same as his pale-skinned men and allowing no form of segregation amongst them. All he cared about was killing power. Where the killers came from was irrelevant to the progressive Jackson. Though the invading British force was over twice the size of Jackson's roughly 5,000 men, they made for easy targets coming up the east bank of the river, and well over 2,000 of them were cut down before they turned and ran, while Jackson lost only 60 soldiers. Jackson had stood at the front amongst his men, gun in hand, in what was a very personal battle for him, and had been entirely venerated for his blinding hatred. He was given several military honors and told that he had done it. He was welcome to come home and return to a life of legislation, but he decided he preferred to keep wandering in the region in case anything else needed to be killed. And as either luck or intense misfortune would have it, depending on whether you're Andrew Jackson, there were more things that needed to be killed. The Spanish in Florida had broken their neutrality during the war, and Jackson didn't really care for them to begin with. So when he caught wind of Fort Negro, which the Spanish had allowed the British to construct in Florida during the war, and which had been turned over to runaway slaves and become a key destination for new runaways, Jackson promptly sent men into Florida without consulting the Spanish and laid siege to the fort, killing most of the runaways and returning whoever was left to a life in chains, probably including some who were never American slaves to begin with. This is one of those choices from Jackson that modern historians tend to view as particularly troublesome, and probably with good reason. Anyhow, after that business, Jackson would be made the American right hand in what would become the First Seminole War, when further disputes between settlers and Native Americans near the border of Florida caught the attention of Washington. Rather than revisit his older scorched earth tactics against the natives, Jackson thought back a decade to his schemes with Aaron Burr and decided to go straight to the source. The natives, in Jackson's view, were emboldened by the Spanish ownership of Florida because it gave them a safe haven to retreat to after battling with settlers. So Jackson wrote a quick letter to American President James Monroe stating that he will have won full possession of the Floridas within 60 days. And then, without waiting to hear whether the fucking president gave him permission to start a war, he marched men to the Spanish fort of St. Mark's, killing Seminoles all along the way. His forces found an easy victory against the Spanish here, and they continued to occupy the fort and the city of Pensacola, slowly dwindling down the morale and fighting force of the surrounding Seminoles and Spaniards. About half of the officials in Washington were fucking furious about Jackson just deciding to start another war with a world power, but key allies like John Quincy Adams saw the potential and advocated on his behalf. Jackson's efforts here are credited with playing a major role in both getting the Spanish to sell Florida and getting the Seminoles to give away their land and fuck off. And things sort of calmed down for a few years now. In 1819, the US entered its first financial depression, and military downsizing sent Jackson into an early retirement from his position as Major General. This also really helped ramp up his dislike for paper currency. But anyhow, he resolved himself to taking more land for America through legislative means rather than immediate physical violence. And as the short-lived governor of the newly acquired Florida, he would complete multiple negotiations to acquire more native land in the region. Jackson had also accidentally made himself a political superstar when the War of 1812 directly resulted in full suffrage for white men, regardless of their land ownership status. Jackson's heroism, image as a Washington outsider, and his vocal blaming of the banks for the current depression created a populist whirlwind that made political allies see Jackson as a decent contender for the 1824 presidency. Well, they initially saw him as a decent diversion candidate, which is someone who isn't actually supposed to win, just take enough votes away from the other guy in certain regions that your party's real candidate can win. That sort of backfired when Washington realized how incredibly popular Jackson was amongst the common man, because most of them had never bothered to ask a common man. Jackson was easily elected as a Tennessee senator in 1822, beating out incumbent John Williams, and his popularity continued to soar leading up to the presidential election. I don't want to bore you all with the minor details of everything that went wrong in the 1824 election, so to summarize briefly, there was a good bit of tomfuckery, and Jackson would not be elected president despite receiving the most votes and generally being the most well-liked. Instead, his old friend John Quincy Adams would become the 6th president of the United States, and despite JQ being a man of ridiculously high intelligence and drive in his own right, Congress didn't like him, and the public hated him because they felt he was an elitist who conspired to rob Jackson of the position, which he very well might have. This made him a largely ineffective president. All this culminated in Jackson becoming even more popular and completely destroying Adams in the 1828 election to become the 7th president of the United States. Jackson's popularity and refusal to play by many rules resulted in a new party being formed with him as the central figure. This would be the Democratic Party that we still have today, and the smaller group that did not support Jackson would coagulate into the Whig Party. The man had such a powerful presence in American politics that he accidentally restructured the entire system. And usually, unless you're James Madison, being elected president is where ridiculous and reckless acts of violence end for you. But not Jackson. He lost his wife just days after his election and before his formal inauguration, which by all accounts made the heartbroken Jackson even more impulsive and short-tempered, but also deepened the bond and affection he felt for America at large. It's been said that he loved the country how one loves a brother or a child. He maintained a strong personal interest in American military affairs and the expansion of the Union in a much more intimate fashion than presidents before him. He also hosted multiple open invitation parties at the White House where he welcomed the general public to come get blackout drunk with him on their taxpayer dime, which were, unsurprisingly, a pretty big hit. What modern historians tend to focus on the most when it comes to Jackson's 8-year reign, however, are his economic priorities. Jackson detested paper money and debt of any kind. He would go on to pay off the entirety of the national debt, which was the only time America ever did so, or, let's be honest, ever will do so. This is generally seen as a quality decision. He also got really fucking weird about the banks, though. He decided that paper money wasn't trustworthy enough to be used in the acquisition of land and property, so he wrote into law that all land sales needed to be done with real silver or gold or be a straight-across trade for other land. This, unsurprisingly, completely fucked up the economy and all land speculation across the nation. Jackson, in general, was not a brilliant economic mind. He thought of himself as a brutish, common-sense advocate protecting the people from higher institutions, which he could have truly been if he hadn't been incredibly unreceptive to criticism. Jackson was known to shout at, challenge to fights, and fire members of his staff that weren't perfectly in step with him. Strong example being his vice president, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun was a passionate South Carolinian, and so when the South Carolina government refused to abide by federal tariffs in what would become known as the nullification crisis, he sided with his state over the federal body he was currently representing. When talks between Jackson and Calhoun turned to secession, Jackson earnestly threatened, "If you secede from my nation, I will secede your head from the rest of your body." Calhoun would not finish out his term as vice president. Jackson's total unwillingness to be told what to do also extended to his dealings with the highest court in the land. When a fair bit of gold was discovered in Georgia on what was technically, as a matter of federal treaty, native land, Jackson asked the Supreme Court for permission to go ahead and take that bit of land back. The court told him fuck no, to which Jackson responded, "I was really just being polite," and instructed Georgia forces and lawmakers to take the land anyway. And this is all very tough talk, but it's a far cry from the tenacity of a younger Jackson, right? Well, Andrew was also the first president to be subjected to an assassination attempt, and the story is much funnier than most attempted murders end up being. On January 30th, 1835, which was well into Jackson's second term as president, he was walking out of the Capitol building when a clinically insane house painter named Dick Lawrence, who historians speculate was more than likely up in fumes, pulled a pistol on the man who was probably responsible for more death than any other living American. Dick found himself in a pickle when the gun misfired, which was commonplace for pistols of the time and not as easily corrected as it is with modern firearms. Not to worry though, because he pulled out his loaded backup pistol, which also proceeded to misfire. Now back then, presidents weren't constantly surrounded by agents whose job it was to zealously protect them, so Jackson simply closed the distance with the would-be assassin himself and began savagely beating him with his cane. No one intervened at first. They figured it was just a well-deserved walloping. But then Jackson just didn't fucking stop. When it seemed like he might have truly intended to beat the man to death, his aides intervened and had to restrain Jackson to save the poor dick. He would close out his presidential reign by drafting and arguing a series of rather brilliant spoliation claims against Denmark, Portugal, and Spain, in which sizable recompense was paid to America for damage done to property and service members who were captured during the Napoleonic Wars. This is hilarious and hypocritical, considering the fact that unnecessary property damage was like Jackson's go-to strategy every time he commanded troops anywhere. But that's just how he rolled. Following his retirement from the Oval Office, Jackson maintained a strong presence in American politics, and even though some people had begun to be hypercritical of his economic policies and the effects they had on the country, his status as a populist icon never really went away, and his vote of confidence in any bill or candidate was a huge boon that almost guaranteed success. In his later years, he would do his best to flex his humanitarian muscles, but it goes without saying that it wasn't his strong suit. As a slave owner himself and someone who understood how inseparable slavery was from the economic prosperity of the South, Jackson would not stand firmly against slavery, but he would write extensively about the necessity for treating slaves humanely in every sense, and making sure that your plantation or whatever the fuck was a place that slaves could see as their home rather than a horrific nightmare world. This is the kind of take that future President Abraham Lincoln would go on to consider fence-rider cringe, but I'm honestly surprised that Jackson decided to rally behind these stances to begin with. The morality of slavery was an obvious back-burner question in his political heyday, but there was very little pressure on him specifically to stand against it. I think what it shows is, despite the testicular propensity and sheer aggressiveness of the man, he had the humility to say, yeah, I totally do this thing, but I try not to be a dick about it, because it's probably a bad thing to do in general. Jackson's heart would finally tire of being so full of constant anger, and would finally give up the fight on June 8, 1845, when Jackson was 78 years old. His final words, directed towards family, friends, and the nation, would be, "Do not cry, be good children, and we will all meet in heaven." The burial instructions he left requested that the tomb of his wife be briefly reopened so that he could be laid to rest with her. And that is the story of Andrew Jackson. If you guys are interested in any other kinds of content, historical or otherwise, go ahead and dump that shit in the comments. Either way, I'll talk to you guys later.